Well, it's good to be online with you then. Thanks for making the time. And if you could introduce yourself a little bit before we get into it, Richard, that'd be great.
Okay. I'm Richard Jones, originally. The Nerzic comes from my wife, who's Breton, French, which explains why I've spent, I suppose, the last 20 years outside of the UK in education, largely in international schools. Also at the European School in Brussels, which is not quite an international school, it's very much a European school. I'm a teacher of history originally, and still a teacher of history. I have been there for 27 years. 27 years of teaching history. I've managed to stay in the classroom, which is great. You know, a few little detours into management, which I managed to escape at various points in my career. I suppose I should say that I'm not just a history teacher as well. I branched out a little bit. In fact, I started off in Wales, which is where I'm from, which is the Jones part.
Yeah.
I was educated in Wales, did history at university. Eventually, I started off doing politics, changed through history, partly because I felt I might end up having to teach the subject, but was in academia for a while. Decided I didn't want to be an academic, wanted to teach, so left after my master's, went into education in 93. Interesting time, because it was a time when the national curriculum in the UK was fully introduced for the very first time. So I actually saw the whole implementation of the national curriculum, which was fascinating from a history point of view, particularly in Wales. And we'll come back to that, because obviously what happened in Wales was very different to England. I did 6 years in the UK, I taught politics in South Wales and Swansea. And then in 99, I escaped the into international education in Toulouse to the Airbus School, which was an extraordinarily interesting time for lots of different reasons. I spent 6 or 7 years there. Then I went to Bratislava, did a little bit of management, again in an IB school. I first started teaching IB at Toulouse in 99, 2000, I think. So this is my 20th year in the IB program, I guess. Then I went to European school in 2007, 2009 actually. That was an interesting opportunity. Again, brought me into contact with European teachers and seeing how, for example, history is taught in Germany and France in particular, but all over Europe, which was a real eye-opener, which was probably the most significant experience for me educationally.
Sure.
In the way it transformed how I think and feel about it. More than back the IB did. But I've come back to the IB in Switzerland 3-4 years ago to a small school, and now into a Swiss school, which is not an international school, which again is an interesting look at the future, in that the IB is expanding outside of the international market into local schools. And in Switzerland, there's going to be a move, although it's still private education. There are some schools, in fact 4 or 5 now, in other parts of Switzerland that are state schools that are beginning to implement the IB curriculum, largely to fulfill a sort of a bilingual curriculum, but also a greater openness, wider opportunities for students who obviously qualify in the IB, which are a little easier to be recognised than the MATI, which is the Swiss equivalent, which I also teach now.
Okay.
So yeah, that's it in brief. I should also point out I teach film and TOK, which is the IB Theory of Knowledge program. I teach film within the IB program. It's a group 6 subject on the arts. And I taught various other social sciences. That's about it.
Okay. Wow. There's a lot there. There's a few things that I obviously I'm looking forward to talk with you about. As you know, I was first, or you were first brought to my attention, I should say, for your history teaching. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I'm especially interested in the TOK and the IB subject, which is probably where we'll spend most of our conversation. But brief detour, you talked a little bit about the management, and you talked about it in fairly obviously negative terms there. I wonder what your experience of that has been. Is it just because you've never particularly enjoyed it? Did you have a bad experience in the management side?
No, it's just, I always felt it's a very unfortunate feature of education, particularly I think in the UK. It's not necessarily the case around the world, certainly not in France or Germany, where you don't really have management schools.
Right.
Schools run the teachers run the school. Whereas in the UK, you have this, and in international education, you have this management scale that you're supposed to climb.
Yeah,
and
right.
As a young teacher, these things are held out to you as something to aspire to. And of course, it comes with responsibility, it comes with often better pay rise and so on.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, it was something that never interested me. I went into education in the classroom, and that's where I've managed to stay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's. Yeah, it's just my camera. I'm hopefully it'll come back on, but as long as you can hear me, I think that's the main thing. Yeah, I certainly feel, I think the same as you do about most of that. My experience, I mean, like you said as well, that it seems that there's a bit of a difference in. I've spent most of my time in EFL. And a lot of that is kind of private schools and language centers, extracurricular type thing. Seems to be a split between the management side, the corporate side, and the education, the academic side. You either have somebody who's from a corporate background managing, while somebody from an academic background kind of runs the faculty. And there's a major split in mentality between those two people. Or you have, what I've tried to do in setting up my own institution, somebody trying to do both, and that's its own special kind of nightmare, as I'm sure you can imagine. So yeah, I think all of that is probably a pretty common experience as far as education management goes. But now that you're in schools, in the European context, do you find it's similar to the UK then? Is it the management there, they run themselves, that kind of thing?
Yeah, what's happened, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, international schools, which are sort of based upon an English model, with their, I think since the crisis, 2007, 2008, in that a lot of the little international schools, the often family run, sometimes charity organizations that were set up locally, that they've been taken over, many of them. This is certainly the case here in Switzerland, where there are very few. This is the home of international education, of course, and there are very few of those private international schools left, which are not run by one of the big 3 or 4 international corporations.
Right.
And what that, I think, has changed also is the culture of those schools. Not only is it brought in, because they often are sort of British owned, not only is it brought in sort of what I would call some of the more nefarious consequences of sort of management reform of education in the UK in the last 15, 20 years, which is had massive negative consequences. And one of the reasons why there are so many British teachers in international education is because they've left that system. But then these international schools sort of adopted those practices, the micromanagement of the classroom in particular, but data-driven, analysis of success and failure, the sort of personal responsibility, the corporate identity is reflected in, you might have a corporate policy on sort of performance management, which is just simply being imposed without any discussion, and it's not a system that actually operates well in education. It's one that's come from a non-educational environment.
Absolutely.
And
that's a conversation I've been having quite a bit lately. In fact, it seems to me there's quite a lot of, you use the word performance there, and that's the word I've been picking up a lot of performance measures that have been ported in from the business world in an attempt, in good faith, I believe, in an attempt to kind of improve education. But it seems to me the way that I've kind of let's say assessed the situation, it seems to me that performance in that context relates to productivity, which is very much the focus in the business world. So increasing productivity is the goal in the corporate environment, but productivity is not what we want to be thinking about in education. And so when we talk about performance, in education, I don't think it should mean productivity. And a lot of these performance management approaches, whether it's at the faculty level or the classroom level, they're focusing on the wrong aspect of performance. I think that's what I've seen, at least.
Yeah, and the danger also then, of course, is that you build a management system of assessing the teacher.
Yeah.
Within that, based upon performance, which is then unfortunately influencing other more traditional inspection aspects of education.
Yeah.
And then you sort of get, it's not only it's tied in with your success or failure within a school as an institution, but it's tied into things of how you actually deliver content in the classroom, or how you
exactly.
And that's where the micromanagement comes in. And the problem also is because you have this middle management that is then responsible for looking after the individual teachers, is that they themselves are being assessed on how effectively they're meeting their targets. And targets might be targets they don't agree with either. But everyone gets caught up in the system of, at the end of the day, these big multinational corporations are only interested in the bottom line. And, if they're making lots of money, they're still not happy, because they could be making more. If they're not making enough money, then you're in trouble.
I mean, you obviously, you have a background in the UK education as well. So, I mean, you must, given what you've just said as well, I assume you share my feelings about this. Far from saying that the UK education system is perfect or the best or anything along those lines at all, but the fact that it is a almost universally public school system, the fact that that corporate financial side of things is largely separate from the education system in the UK, something that I think that's one of the things I look back at the UK and think that they had a good handle on that, because as soon as you bring business into education, I yet to see it really work well on a large scale. Some institutions can handle it, I think, if they're set up with the right goals in mind. But as far as the system goes, when you've got a corporate financial system of education, it just seems to go off track in terms of what the objectives are supposed to be.
I'd say that there was a period, say 30 years ago. I'm going to be a history teacher here, but in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, under Thatcher, the implementation of the national curriculum, it came with a series of other reforms, which effectively made even what you call the public sector, which public schools and private schools in the UK is sort of a complex thing. The state sector, if you call it the state sector, which even made the state sector have to follow, to some extent, the privatized model, because schools were made self-governing with their own budgets. They were made to compete with league tables, which publish results. They introduced an Ofsted system where you were being assessed on things that you had no control over, and it was incredibly difficult system to be part of, and it's got worse. And again, I'd come back to the point, it led a number of teachers to leave the profession, which there's, I can go back to my the group I qualified with as teachers 20 odd years ago, and within 4 or 5 years, I'd say at least half of them were out of education. Many of us then left. Everyone I was teaching with 25 years ago, those were still teachers, are in international education. And that's the problem,
Is that what brought you out of the UK then to the international?
That, to some extent, I would say the biggest problem is workload. The expectation on the British teachers are completely unrealistic, and the problem is British teachers don't realise that until they get a chance to see what happens in the rest of the world. British teachers work in 32 periods, 34 periods of lessons a week. I work in a system. European school where I worked for 7 years, 8 years. They had to standardise between all European countries.
Okay. I was just about to ask
countries that had very few lessons a week and countries that had a lot. And they went therefore for a number of lessons a week that was sort of a European average. That was 21. 21 lessons a week, which for the French was astronomical. How we expected to plan and deliver effectively a curriculum in 21 periods a week, when they used to do 14 or 16 or whatever. But for British teachers, it was like, what, you mean I don't have to be in school for 2 days a week?
Yeah, right.
And the British teachers don't understand that aspect of,
Mm-hmm.
of how difficult it is. But I was teaching in a very good, very successful school, like mainly A-level classes. But they were massive, 25 kids, 30 kids in a class. It was the workload,
Right.
it was the market that killed me. I remember the Christmas before I left the country, on Christmas Day, I had to mark essays, because if I didn't, I would never have got them finished by the time I
Wow,
went back
yeah.
to school.
Yeah.
And this is madness. And it hasn't got better, it's got worse, if anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it
So,
seems to be. I mean, I've not been back there for a long time, but anytime there's a couple of people who are in the system there that I speak to. Anytime I do, it just sounds like it's moving in completely the wrong direction at the moment. So yeah, you've gone international. I'm over here. I mean, I'm not teaching in the school system here, as it were. Although I'm now beginning to do more work with schools, but from a consultancy level rather than teaching, I suppose. But yeah, it's very different. As you get outside of your bubble, you start to see the different options. And as you say, if there's a teacher who's spent their entire career in the UK, they might be completely unaware of what it's like outside.
That's another thing that's damaged international schools, I think, actually, in the last 15, 20 years as well, because as well as the big corporations taking over, particularly in the last 10 years, because the situation is so bad in the UK, it's very easy for them to recruit from the UK.
Right.
And so I've seen, continually see, these young teachers in their 20s coming from the UK into these private international schools, which initially, 20 years ago, would have had a workload that was reasonably manageable, reason for the attraction. But under companies, I'm not going to mention names, but under the big companies, that they've gradually increased the workload in international schools as well.
Because the British teachers can handle it.
They can handle it. And it's madness. Right. It's absolute madness. And I'm standing here in Switzerland. If you look around the lake here in Switzerland where I am, there are two or three companies which have bought out maybe 15 of the international schools around the lake in the last 10 years. And every year the workload has increased. And pay is static.
Sure, yeah. Yeah. Again, it seems to be that productivity orientation. That it's very much a business model, which, I mean, it's not that certainly I don't have all the answers, but as much as we can keep education separate from that model, it seems to be the better for the learning. But I guess somebody's got to manage it somewhere along the lines. So you're also, in that context, you're teaching IB. So I want to. That's something that I'm very, very new to. I don't teach it. I've not got any direct experience with it, but for a number of reasons, I've been looking into it lately, very, very newly. So there's something there that I'd like to explore. But more specifically, first the history. So you said you started in politics before you moved into history. Was there a connection there for you? Was that a natural progression, or was that a complete change of direction for you?
No, I'd obviously come as a kid in school, never studied politics before. I was interested. Right. It got me interested in the politics. I wanted to study politics at university. The universities back when I studied, you had to do a fairly broad range of courses in your first year. I did quite well in the history and the politics. So I said, why not do a joint? And at the back of my mind was the fact that if I wanted to become a teacher, I needed a degree in the subject. So it was with hindsight, I realized that was probably an important decision in becoming a history teacher.
Right. So history is interesting for me of late, because the main focus of my work with teachers lately has been trying to increase applied learning in the classroom. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm from a background in language teaching, EFL specifically. And what I've basically been working on for the last couple of years is trying to bring some of the principles that have become common in the EFL context for the better, trying to bring those into other subjects. In a lot of ways, EFL is often kind of at the forefront of development in education, I think largely because it's so commercial. That there's kind of more time, there's more funding, I suppose, there's more competition, and so there's a lot of progress gets made in terms of in terms of pedagogy and research and stuff in the EFL environment, I think, than there is in others. And so while it's never really mainstream, it's going on in specifically in EFL classrooms and language centers and things like that. There are a lot of practices in the EFL in EFL teaching that I think are beneficial to learning in any context. And so what I've been working on in the last couple of years is working with schools and teachers across the subjects to try and incorporate some of these concepts into other subjects. And one of the areas that I'm most interested in is application, applied learning, where it's kind of just central to language teaching is the application, or good language teaching at least, is communicating, using what you've learned in the classroom to have real conversations and communicate in real ways. You can't really do language learning without that. But that's not so common in other subjects. And so I believe it should be and can be. And two of the subjects that I've struggled most with are maths, because there is such a large portion of the maths curriculum that's quite abstract, and finding application for some of those is not always easy. And then history, a subject that I was never particularly strong in. I only spent the years studying it in school where you kind of have to. So there's a couple of years really where I studied history to any depth. So it's not a subject I spent a lot of time with. And then the obvious kind of disconnect, because history is about the past. And so the application of facts about the past is, again, not an obvious thing. But I've generally kind of put out the line that, well, we need to look at how does what we've learned about the past apply to the present day and the future. But I'm come at that from, in very broad terms. So I wonder what your kind of thoughts on that are. How does the study of history and things from the past, how does that apply?
You've asked the question, which I can remember being asked something like that by a snotty kid, probably about your age now, I guess, actually.
Sure.
In my teaching practice school. And fortunately, standing next to me was the head of department, because I wasn't sure how to answer it. And he was able to take on, because it was about the options for GCSE. You said you didn't do GCSE, so whatever, O level. So you made that decision to drop history. By the way, I should point out that's unique in Europe, pretty much. Every other country makes history compulsory to the end.
Oh, right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So I teach, for example, history at the moment in Switzerland. The kids have to do it till they're
okay.
And Europe,
for me, it was history or geography, and I went with geography.
You see, and so you get an opportunity to drop history. I can't remember what his response was, but it was certainly an eye-opener for me that anyone would obviously, from my point of view, I've been so engaged with the subject for so long, from at the age of 23, so long, but I didn't understand I wouldn't obviously see the relevance of it. But it's something that you come to realize quite quickly as a teacher, that kids don't have a natural, because it is about the past. What's the point? Shouldn't we be thinking about the future? That sort of thing. So how do I respond to it today? I mean, there's lots of different approaches that you take as a teacher. I'm quite philosophical. On my postgrad work is in philosophy, so I will talk philosophically about it and say, well, look, good. If you imagine waking up tomorrow and you can't remember anything about your life, how would you cope? How would you live your life without knowing anything about, for example, who you are, or what you've done, or how you got to be where you are today? And you just say, okay, that's for the individual what history is, society. So you start with that and you say to them, look, you can't begin to understand the world without some reference to the past. And then you have to go into examples to make it concrete. And then you start talking about whatever's on the news today. Right. So at the moment, you'd be talking about the fact that this morning, they replaced that statue of Colston in Bristol with Black Lives Matters statue. Yeah. And you say, well, why is that on the news? Is that important? Why is it important? How can you make sense of it? How do you make sense of anything without some sort of historical context to put that into? And ultimately, that is what history is all about. And it's interesting when you study history, or the way in which history is taught outside of the UK, where history is often only about content. It is often, it's only about declarative knowledge. It's about learning the nation's past. That's often what it is. And when you have it in those terms, and when it's a state-run system, as most education systems are, and where in most countries history is strictly controlled by the state, so teachers have to deliver deliver a particular curriculum, and there are particular textbooks written by particular authors which have to be sanctioned. You know, the UK is very different in that respect. You are basically transferring an approved set of events that happened in the past, which are essential to the nation's understanding of who
its own identity, right? Yeah,
it is. It's all about identity, and that's where the politics comes in as well.
Yeah, sure.
So obviously, you know, when you start talking about making sense of the world in terms of an historical context, and then bringing up the examples, you enter into discussion. And then you're into the sort of the analytical aspects of history. Well, who gets to decide which history you study, and why are you studying this event, and why is the news covering that event, and why is it important that you understand where the election of Donald Trump fits historically into American politics, and why was that so unusual? And you can't answer anything without that historical context. So you're constantly doing that as a history teacher. I'm sure this is true of all history teachers. It is rare that a lesson that you teach in history doesn't have a current affairs dimension. In fact, there used to be, in some of the curricula I taught 20 years ago, there used to be a unit of study which was part of GCSE, which was called past present activity. And there would be a part of the exam which had to look at an event that was something that had happened in the previous 2 years. And the students had to compare it to something that had happened previously.
I see, okay.
So it's making that connection. But yeah, it's an incredibly important thing. But it's something that history teachers who love their subject often neglect. But it is ultimately, I have to say, it ultimately is that subject content and the discussions and debate and the discourse that happens about the past. It is the content of the past that is central to history. The rest of the stuff is peripheral. And you will get history teachers talking about the transferable skills and the importance of analysis of documents and how it prepares you. You know, they'll point out that many history students become lawyers or become politicians or become because you're very good at reading an awful lot of data and identifying bias and being able to, summarize extraordinarily well, because that's what you do. To cut through, the noise and get to the point. And historians, in school, the way history is taught has been transformed in the last 30 years, so that, they now have that sort of practical dimension of looking at documents from the past and asking questions about provenance and utility and so on. I don't personally think that's a really central part of what history is about. As I said, it's a peripheral dimension. I think if you want to look at the analysis of documents, sure, you can do that in history, but you can do it just as well in English. Or we could be in sociology and teach it, or we could be doing a bit of philosophy if you really wanted to think philosophically about the past. You don't have to do it in history. What makes history important and unique is that engagement with the past. And ultimately, for me at least, the importance of all education is to make sense of the world in which the kid is living. That's it. And history does that. But it does so by engaging with the past, not by teaching literacy skills or 21st century skills or analysis of documents or how to write an essay. That's part of what happens, but it's a byproduct. History is really ultimately about that. I come back to that declarative knowledge and how it gets to be the knowledge that is passed on.
No, I think that's all right. I think there's not a lot to disagree with there. I think the challenge I find is, as you said, well, as a teacher in any subject, and so as a teacher in history, the chances are you're something of an amateur historian at the very least, right? So you're there one way or another because you're interested in history as a subject. And as teachers in any subject, I think it's an easy mistake to make, to think that, my subject is the most interesting subject in the curriculum because I love it, so everybody else must. And that's rarely the case when you've got, however many students in a class, whether it's 15 or 30. Not all 15 of them or not all 30 of them are going to be swept away by history. Maybe 2 or 3 of them will be. And it's then, what do you find in history? What do you find are the things that really do increase the engagement and the level of interest from 3 out of 30 students to more than that?
Yeah. The enthusiasm of the teacher, which
Yeah, definitely.
we've just identified as being central to your teacher, is absolutely central to that
Sure.
process of, I'm not going to say, but proselytizing the subject, because you're one subject amongst many, and they all have their value. But I think all teachers need to be in there saying, look, this is important because it has to be genuine. The worst history, like in the worst any form of teaching, is when you're doing it because it's a job, and it's not passion. You've got to believe in what you're doing. And little example: 20 years ago, I used to teach Nazi Germany, as you do, and I used to have to spend a lot of time on what we might describe as empathy, trying to get the kids to understand how it was possible that sensible German, middle class, educated, perfectly normal bourgeois individuals could ultimately allow something so horrific to happen. I don't have to explain that anymore.
Right.
Because we're living it.
We're seeing more of it now,
so,
yeah.
Absolutely. So 20 years ago, it had to come from a passionate engagement, and look, this is what it could happen again. I don't have to do that anymore.
Because it is. Yeah.
There. It's right in your face. So don't underestimate the importance of an enthusiastic teacher, right? The rest of it is just good teaching. And you obviously, you acquire over the years a range of influences on how you do things, sometimes from other teachers, sometimes, from text, from, philosophically, from the works of, from educationalists. When you said, not every kid in the class is going to be as interested as you are. I think you can go back through your career and you can look at books or authors that have influenced you. And I think right at the beginning of my career, back in the early 90s, Howard Gardner's work, which is less popular today for lots of reasons. Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences. The most important thing I got from that was a realization that history teachers, like all teachers, tend to replicate the learning environment that worked for them. But they're successful academics generally, who are quite good either mathematically or with the with the literacy and so on. And so it was a realization for me at the time that you needed to be aware that not everybody learns the way you do, and of course that reflects the way then you think about planning your lessons. Now, you don't have to talk about multiple intelligences in terms of assessing all the different learning styles and so on. But even if it's just to recognize that if you've got a range of different activities and assessments within, I keep going back to assessment, but try not to be driven by it. But if you keep coming back to a range of activities, should we say, that you value, which generally need to be assessed, then that range of activities needs to allow for the kid who's good dramatically or artistic, or perhaps the kid who's really, really shy, but if you give them a chance to go away and research something because, that's what they're good at, and comes back with a great piece of work, that's fine. So since that time, I've done a lot of role play, for example, in the classroom, which I know is classics of language learning stuff as well.
Of course, yeah.
I should point out that I tend in international education, particularly in the European school now where I'm at the moment, I'm teaching history as a target language. These kids are not English first language, so I'm a bit of well.
Yeah.
So getting them talking, getting them engaging, getting them reading closely and with each other. So yeah, mixing up the environment of the classroom. So yeah, you'll go from, I'm good at the didactic stuff. I like doing my speeches and I like talking to the class. So I have to restrict myself. And I say, okay, no, I'm going to make sure I do different things in this. But I do feel that's my strength, and that's what I play to, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. I just go back to one little example about that. Again, in the early part of the last decade, 2000, 2001, the school at Toulouse was very special because it was Europe's first laptop school for a start. And so every kid had a computer. And we were encouraged to get involved in the IT dimension. And I designed a website for the kids, and you personalize the curriculum in many ways. They were able to navigate their own way through. They didn't need to be told. So we started moving towards the sort of more I suppose it was the classic child-centered 1960s approach, but it was investigative learning. It was inquiry-based. It was always a question and they could follow these things through on their own, largely because it was a website that supported them.
Right.
And that was all very good. The problem was, though, that they would all work at different speeds, of course, and I never got to do any teaching.
Yeah, right.
I resent it, and I'd say, look, okay, so every two or three, 4 lessons, I can remember actually doing a film because I did a workshop once in for Bector, which was the organisation in the UK back in the 2000s that was really trying to drive ICT in education in the UK. And I went and gave a speech about laptop learning in I can't remember, it was in Leeds or something. And I did a film. I made a film of my students, just fly on the wall, just to show what happened in my lessons. And it was amazing. I look back on it now and think, goodness me, yeah, it really was like that. So that I filmed them coming in the classroom, getting the computers out, logging on, getting on with the work, and I was just standing there. Yeah. I wasn't doing any teaching. They were just genuinely, they had been conditioned now. And then I took the camera around and I showed the screens, and they were all doing different things. They're all aged, but different stages. Some researching something, some answering some questions, something else. And I had about 2 or 3 weeks difference in the work that was going on in the classroom. Really? So you had to then do these plenary sessions where everyone had finished finally. Okay, we can stop and have a plenary. Yeah. Can you remember? You did this 2 weeks ago. Can you remember what it was like? Which was fantastic. It was a wonderful experiment to see how that could happen. Mm-hmm. I felt something was lacking, but I still do a bit of that whenever I have an opportunity. Yeah. And I'm now back in school where the kids are on iPads. Mm-hmm. So the lessons now begin in a similar way. My website's on the screen behind me before I do anything. They're logging on, or they're probably already logged on. They're on my website. They're carrying on where they left off. And I don't have to say that anymore. Yeah. But I tend to do rather more of the front of class talk. Partly, and I'll be honest, because I'd be bored if I wasn't doing it. And the worst thing a teacher can be is bored.
Sure.
And so, it's just a compromise. Like all in education, it's a balance between the individual learning of the student and the need for the teacher to want to teach. Yeah.
No, I think there's no surprise. There should be no surprise that finding a happy medium somewhere in the middle is usually the goal. Obviously, it's another one of those kind of pendulum scenarios, I think, where you end up seeing the extreme opposites of something take hold for a while. Student-centered learning still a relatively new concept when we look at education as a historical thing, and
don't forget geographically as well, because I have that experience, right? And I can assure you that you teach in the European school and you've got kids coming from Greece or from Cyprus or from Slovakia or from the Czech Republic or from Poland. And if you look at Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, particularly Catholic countries actually, where education is still largely controlled indirectly by the church, for example.
Sure.
History still is the way, pretty much I was taught history 40 years ago, or even before that, in that there is a textbook. And this week we're doing pages 15 to 22.
Yep.
And next week we do 23 to 28. And at the end of 6 weeks, you're going to be tested on the content of those pages.
Yeah, the things that you read in the book and heard from the lecturer, right? The teacher.
That's it. And that is. Now, to some extent, that is still history teaching throughout most of Europe and indeed around the world.
Well, here in Indonesia, that's most subjects. Most subjects follow that format still. Yeah.
Okay, exactly. So, again, personally, I come from an interesting perspective. I was the last of the O-level generation in the UK, so I did history like that. Without skills. And it was a guy at the front of the class writing stuff on the board. You wrote down in your book, remembered it, and then regurgitated in the examination. I wasn't actually very good at that.
Right.
I liked the content, but I wasn't good at sitting and listening to this guy.
Likewise.
So I was not a great student actually in school. I became a successful student at university, not at school. Right. But it's worth noting. You said it was a temporal thing. It's geographical.
No, you're right about that. Yeah.
And I'm now in a school in Switzerland, in the Swiss national education. It's different in the cantons, but in the history teaching in federal Switzerland, that is the state level, is still content.
Yeah,
and remember,
it's interesting. I mean, perhaps somewhat similar to you. I had a realization relatively recently, I suppose. I've gone through a couple of transitions early on, and still now. but in different forms. Yeah, a large part of what I do is trying to increase student activity and student autonomy,
Right.
and doing that for myself as a teacher when I started, and then now as I work with other teachers, trying to increase student centricity, and to reduce those lecture driven sessions. And then I sort of had a second, or a later realization somewhat recently, that in some of my, particularly in my training sessions, rather than when I'm teaching English or teaching in the college, but rather when I was training teachers, I found that I would go off on these kind of mini lectures where I would be speaking quite a lot. And I look back and thought, oh, am I doing the very thing that I've been working so hard to reduce? And to some extent I was, to some extent, it was something I had to get control of, perhaps. But I also realized there, I don't know if this is rationalization, but I quite strongly believe this to be true, and you might have something to say about it as well. I realized there is quite a big difference between a teacher who's passionate about what they're talking about and is telling anecdotes and giving examples and engaging with the students in quite an impassioned way, which is what I was doing because I love what I teach and I love what I do, and then comparing that to the lectures that come from a teacher who's essentially just reading out of a textbook or reading a paper or reading an essay. They're not the same thing. And I still listen now. I mean, we're making this video, which is they get quite long and people do sit and watch them. I listen to podcasts, which are hours and hours of content. I'll sit and listen to them and enjoy them very much. If you've got an impassioned speaker who's delivering something that they clearly care about, it's very, very different from the kind of lectures that I'm actually trying to reduce, because they're not engaging. There's a big difference there, I think.
No, that's it. And I like what you said earlier about the pendulum. Because once you've been in education long enough, you've seen it come back and forth a few times.
That's right. Yeah.
And the debate back in the the national curriculum in the UK was introduced in '88, and it came out of what was the GCSE reforms previously to that, which then sort of inspired the national curriculum. And if you go back to the debate, is fascinating. I said earlier, and I was a history teacher in Wales at that time, and it's an interesting thing to reflect on the fact that Wales there was no national curriculum for history before '88. What was going on in the classroom was up to the individual teachers.
Right.
Now, there was a tendency for the programme to be quite similar, because local education authorities in the UK had a degree of influence on what was going on in the classrooms. They provided resources, or textbooks at a national level were providing content. But there was a revolution in the UK in the late '60s. History was in danger. History was being subsumed into the humanities. And there genuinely was a history is in danger. They set up what we now call pressure groups to try and save history. They reinforced the I suppose you call them Professional Association for History, and so that started to take a more campaigning role. And one of the things that they did was, let's take that model of history I was talking about earlier, which was the lecture, chalk, talk, write down, remember. And they blew it out of the water. They said, hey, we've got to do something to get turned on by that form of history. There was an organization called the Schools Council History Project in the 70s, which was partly influenced by the whole revolution in the 60s, but both within historiography, but also in pedagogy as well. So you've got to think of the 60s with a revolution in history, because all of a sudden women, minorities, the working class suddenly found a voice. And it wasn't all about dead kings and dead politicians. And the way in which history was being taught in universities, particularly new universities, remember the massive expansion in higher education in the UK in the 60s. Those new colleges, new professors, often who would never have been working at Oxford or Cambridge, were now, it's the history man sort of story. David Lodge, the author, writing about universities in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, so they had to come up with, well, how do we do it? What do we do? How do we make it more engaging? And that's when they came up with we don't have to just do essays. John Slater, I think John Slater was his name, who was the HMI, Majesty's Inspector for History Education in the late 80s, mid 80s, reflected on that period and spoke about the fact that skills, did we even use the word? There were no skills in history teaching. It was essays and remembering. And what happens then in the 70s is a revolution. And this revolution has gradually, over the last 40, 50 years, made its way around the world. And as I said, in some parts of it hasn't got there yet. Now, in terms of swings and pendulums, the UK had that revolution in the 70s. into the 80s, it massively influenced the way in which GCSE was delivered. And they were doing radical things. You know, one of the things very controversial at the time, empathy was a subject within history that was assessed. Put yourself in the position of somebody in the past.
Right.
Okay. Imagine what they would have been like, what they'd have felt like, how they'd. It's a fundamental thing we do in history. Of course we do this, and we do it, and historians do it as well. Of course, you have to. That's how you engage with the past. Avoiding the enormous condescension of posterity. Those are the words of E.P. Thompson. Right. That's about empathy. But we had to try and get this in the classroom. They came up with ways, and the kids. Empathy might be through role play. Obviously, you're going to play these characters in this historical event. These are the things we know. How would they have acted? And it's fantastic. It's engaging. The kids love it. But then they go as far as to assess it in examination. Right. So you have to do empathy. How do you grade that?
Right. Yeah. And this is something that's happened here lately. In fact, I think we're transitioning quite nicely into curricula now. So we might head in that direction. There's still one thing I want to touch on with history though, but that's something that's happened here lately. There was a huge overhaul in the curriculum in, I would say in 2013, because it's officially called the 2013 curriculum. But I would argue it's not really been implemented to this day. But the official kind of policy release was back in 2013. And one of the things that they tried to do was introduce more character development into the curriculum, which was a great idea. And it was the kind of thing I'd been talking about for several years, beforehand. And I was quite happy to see that being introduced as a policy until, similar to what you've just described, I realized it was just a new field of examination. And so you would have things like collaboration and entrepreneurialism and all of these various things that were, kind of character oriented, but then there would be a score for it. So your marks out of 100 or marks out of 10 for entrepreneurialism. How can you do that?
Yeah. Look,
so there are things that need to be developed, but how we can expect to assess them. And then what you end up with is you've mentioned on a number of subjects already, you get this, what we call the backwash or the washback effect, where you end up then the teachers are just finding the best way to approach it to increase the score rather than actually to increase the development. And it comes back to that same performance oriented approach.
And that for me, if I go back to the days before the national curriculum, we had a wonderful opportunity also this year without GCSEs. Let's suddenly stop and think, do we really need them? Let's have 5 years without that backwash effect in education. Let's stop the tail wagging the bloody dog, Let's have that let's make the most of this opportunity and say, okay, do we really need to be getting a number on everything? I'm going to take you back to the history working group that was established to write the national curriculum for history in the mid-1980s. And they were given a model, a TGAT model it was called. I can't remember what it stands for anymore, but they had to say, well, what is history? How you grade it? And you've got to grade it out of 10.
Right. Yeah,
so what are your skills? What are your skills? Okay, and what are you going to, and what are the levels in a subject that is neither easily broken into different skills,
sure,
and certainly not numbered from 1 to 10.
Right.
But they came up with it. They were stuck in a room for a weekend and had to write it because the government, Thatcher's government, insisted it was done.
Right.
It's fascinating. But some of the consequences of that were that they were forced to think about what those skills were. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they did was say, okay, interpretations of the past are an essential historical skill. Now, that was probably the very first time, really, that in education, at a school level, students were now told that part of what you have to do in history is look at the past, look at the way in which those other people, notably historians, have looked at the past, and try to understand why they disagree with each other. It was introducing a problematic that kids traditionally would never have got, which is different to looking what I would call that's more of a philosophical perspective on the past. There's also a macro level. There's a micro level that the historian and the history student does, which is when you look at the detail. And this is where you do literary analysis, where you look at the bias, where you look at the subjectivity and so on. Then look at the nature of the source. Why is that newspaper likely to be in the... And that was given a different category by this work.
Right, okay.
And that, I think, in the long run, enormously beneficial.
Sure.
Because it forced a generation of teachers to develop lessons that could assess those various
Right.
things. EMPA
And
could gradually got pitched, but
yeah, all right, okay. But also I
subject.
think
But
just
that stuff's still
to
there.
think about what you're doing, right? So I think it's a relatively, again, in the historical sense, it's a relatively new thing for teachers to conceptualize teaching and to conceptualize what it is they're teaching, rather than the kind of the schoolhouse model where your job is to just come in and deliver content, take take what's in the textbook and put it into the students' heads, and that's the job of teaching. And then to actually kind of conceptualize, okay, well, what is teaching and what am I doing and what is the subject? That's quite a new idea globally, I think.
Yeah, and this is going to bring me on. Unless you've got another history question, I want to go into the IB at that point.
Yeah, so just one last thing then, because I think we are moving on quite nicely, but there was something I wanted to ask from a while back, actually. You talked about the, I suppose, the constructed narrative of how history is taught in some countries, and some countries it's perhaps more than others. It's not something I realized until I came here to Indonesia, and I realized that what's being two sides of it. First, I realized what was being taught here in Indonesia, and I thought, wow, that's not the full story. And I met a number of Indonesian friends here who had studied at school here and had later gone to work or study overseas, and they had their eyes open to realize that they'd only heard half of the story. And I remember at that point thinking, well, first being quite shocked by that, and then thinking, how does that apply to my experience studying in the UK? And it does seem that we're not quite as overbearing as some countries are. You can think of the obvious candidates for this, but there are certainly things where in the UK we would have been taught a sugar-coated version of certain colonial activities and things like that, where the UK would have been perhaps portrayed as the hero in stories where maybe others wouldn't see it that way. To what extent, as a history teacher, have you kind of faced tension there in what you're teaching and what you feel about it? And have you ever been kind of up against the narrative in any way?
That's a great question. Let me again. If you look at, I'm fascinated by history textbooks, old ones. And you look at the way history was taught, say, in the 1940s, 1930s, and so on. And you got to think about the audience at that time. That was generally, for grammar school, it was all private schools. And it was male, and it was making them learn the landmarks, and it was about heroes and young boys learning all about heroes. I've got a fantastic, hundreds of books here, but there's one book in particular, which is this one, actually. I've got it just here, which is called The Use of History, written by Rouse, who was a very successful academic. And there are extracts in here about why history is important. What is the use of history, right? And he says things in there like, and he's only talking about boys for a start.
Of course, yeah.
No girls. Girls aren't to be educated.
I remember, was it the John Donne's treatise on education? It's just when your boy goes to school, and that's it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's exactly that. But he then talks about, the moral value of learning about the lives of, and the list is, Drake, Raleigh, Rhodes, who recently had his statue removed from Oxford College, the Rhodes Scholarship. It just tells you how much that is a moment in time. So that's where we were, and it didn't change an awful lot until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, then there was a revolution in education, and we could do it in the UK because we had no national system. And it was a bottom-up thing, and the IB was as well. And this is my, I'll come on to the IB in a second, but the IB was a bottom-up revolution as well.
Right.
Led by, again, it was largely British, but there were obviously others involved. But in the 60s, in history education in particular, I mentioned it earlier, the way in which the past was being used in universities changed. We started to look at women. We started to look at minorities. We started to look at the working class, probably working class first. So social history, economic history, these were new subjects. And university departments, new universities like York and Essex and so on, started to have departments of these subjects. Graduates coming out of that needed a way to be able to teach it. And that's where the school's history project came in. So in my very first year, my very last weeks of my training, I still had a class that was not national curriculum. It was the year 9 class. They were going to be the last. They were going to enter GCSE. The 7s coming in the year after were going to be
on that. Okay.
So I had 1 year with the 9s, and what a great year that 9 was. We could do what we learned. I did 6 weeks on the assassination Kennedy. It was all over the place, First World War, but it was brilliant because it was written by, and this is the other thing, it was written by the teacher based upon resources that he picked from various places. And he could do that because there was no national curriculum. And that's what happened in the 70s. And one of the things that history was very rich with, and again, this is something that other countries struggle, I think, with, because there isn't this tradition, history teachers as authors. Because history teachers could produce their own materials, could get a little consortium together, publish it, and across a local authority, let's do a bit of local history, let's do, based on passion.
Yeah, right.
And we lost a lot. We lost a lot when that went out the window. But to be fair, the national curriculum and GCSE to some extent had to take on board, particularly in terms of those skills we spoke about earlier, that process learning rather than the declarative knowledge. That element remained. Thatcher tried with the history national curriculum to say we will write down these facts and the children will learn them. She wanted to go back to an approved narrative that every child would have to learn. And her education minister struggled to come up with something that would work. It was incredibly controversial. Read the press in the late 80s, when this was all being debated, and I was a history student. Every week there'd be a debate led by the right or the left. And they were fighting for the future of education as they saw it, what our children will learn about their past. And I can remember, this what are the dates? And the right would come up with 1066.
Of course,
all of that. And then the left would say, well, what was wrong with the Married Women Property Act of whatever, 1885? I mean, that was just as important. And that's where it was. And in the end, it was unresolved because there would be no national examinations. History stopped being I have to say the big negative consequence. History stopped being a compulsory subject. The original national curriculum had all these 9, 10 subjects compulsory to the end. When they decided to allow options, I felt that was a massive loss. And I'm now so used to working in education systems where history is compulsory. It just seems such an oversight. So
yeah, that's interesting.
It's just completely wrong.
That
a child doesn't have at least some history. It's like philosophy being taught in France or indeed in Switzerland. To the end.
Absolutely, we got no philosophy when I was at school. No, absolutely. Unless it was in literature.
Anyway, so my answer to your question is, I think I answered it actually, is that you saw it, you still see it. It's a legacy of that time. But it's much less pronounced than, for the reasons I've given, than as you've identified in other countries. Because in other countries, history is in the curriculum, obviously, because it helps create that sense of national identity. It's about creating a narrative of who we are and who the others are.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's, although perhaps not explicitly, certainly thinking of the context here, not explicitly, but for those reasons, in some ways, it's kind of, it's almost treated as one of the most important subjects, but not perhaps for the right reasons, not in the ways that, you lament the loss of history as a core subject. But you're not thinking in terms of here where it's one of the most important subjects because it's how we train the minds of our young people.
It's how you create young citizens.
Exactly.
Young subjects, possibly is a better way to describe
exactly
it.
Right.
But that is again, it's the sort of the dialectical approach. These two things clashing, and what we had in the UK in the 70s was a bottom up driven change to the curriculum, which, because it lost that transfer of culture across the generations, that sort of traditional idea of what education was, that if I go back to even to the 19th century, because it lost that, it also lost its obvious use to the politicians, to the government, to the state, and it lost its importance, therefore, because it was just one subject among others. Which is why, when Thatcher wanted it to be a compulsory subject, her view of it was, of course, it would help to create docile, obedient, loyal subjects. And of course, it lost that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I got a single fly.
I've seen it flying around. No, you just seem very passionate, that's all.
No. Okay, so the IB comes out of that same period.
Yeah, right.
The IB is exactly the same age as me. It's 50. It's born in 68. It was born here in Switzerland. It opened up in. It was a response, international education, briefly, First international school was probably International School of Geneva. I'm pointing that way,
Yeah.
not far from here. And it was established in the 1920s. There had been, of course, schools abroad before then, for usually for services, but that was national curriculum abroad. It wasn't an international
Right.
school.
Okay.
Now, this was a school that was established to offer support for the organization called the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. And it was established with the headquarters in Geneva. And of course, if you needed to bring highly qualified diplomats from around the world to Geneva, they were going to be of a certain age where, although in the UK you had public schools to provide an education for the children, and they were sent off to boarding school, not the case everywhere. So you needed to provide some form of educational service that a kid who's 12 or 13 who doesn't have a local language, French, would still be able to cope. And that's where international education started. The first international curriculum was actually for the European schools. Same purpose, same principle. After the Second World War, establishment of the European community as the coal and steel community in Luxembourg initially, which is where the headquarters were, then in Brussels, required schools. And so they didn't just set up schools, they also set up a curriculum from the beginning, which was unique to those schools, which is the European school curriculum with its own baccalaureate. Right. So the kids who go to those, I think there's 17 of those schools now across Europe. The kids who go to those schools, and so I taught there for 7 years, have a curriculum that is written uniquely for those schools, and they have a right to go to any university in Europe if they pass.
Okay.
That's the way it works. So if you look at UCAS points for UK universities, you have IB grades, you have A-level grades, and you have each score for the European Baccalaureate as well.
Right.
So they developed a curriculum in the 50s. And from my point of view, what's fascinating about both the IB and the European school is, let's say, 15 years before IB, is their number one priority and concern was history. How do we teach history internationally? And for all the reasons we've been talking about, history had been inculcation of national values, national
very
culture,
walled up.
And now you have to suddenly teach kids who are not all of the same nationality in the classroom. How do you do it? And that's the question I still get asked.
Without offending anybody.
Right. Exactly. So I still get asked that question. First question, you said anyway, I'm an international school history teacher. Whose curriculum do you teach? Whose history do you teach? And that's what the IB was. In the early 60s, the first meetings are in 61, 62, and they're thinking about, because the problem was, of course, they had these international schools, but then at the end of the international schools, they all had to do their own national curriculum, which is extraordinarily expensive. So you had these kids they go through 15 years of schooling or whatever it was in École or in one of the other international schools. And at the end, they'd have to decide to sit the French back, English A-levels, the Abitur, Mathieu, or whatever, in different national programs. It made no sense at all. So that's what the IB was established to try and create, a form of post-compulsory schooling. They were gatekeepers. It was about creating an education system with an examination system at the end, which would give them access to university. Right. And so the biggest concern for the IB when they started in the late 60s was, can we get accredited? Will the university accept us? And they were very fortunate in that they were led by, Alec Peterson, I think his name was the guy who was just like the godfather of the IB back in the day. But they had a number of people at that time in the 60s, when there was a lot of innovation going on from various universities across Europe. The French were very interested, the Germans were very interested. Interesting, the British government were not, and yet it ended up being a very British-style curriculum. Right. But for example, that they have TOK. This theory of knowledge course within the IB goes right back to the beginning. The extended essay goes right back to the beginning. And they were set up because of the influence mainly of the French. TOK certainly, because the first TOK program was actually written by the inspector for philosophy in the French schools. And and the idea that would be compulsory started then as well. Right, okay. But I would say, because I've been thinking about that, as I said to you, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Right. And I'm currently in a school, which is a Swiss school, which is introducing the IB for the very first time because of all the things we've been talking about, because they want to have a more student. They're a school that's already quite innovative. A lot of IT invested. They talk about personalized learning and student, and it's very, very, very removed from a traditional Swiss school. So they're looking for a curriculum that suits that, and the IB is where they're going for it. Right. And I'd say because I had these discussions, and I obviously had to explain to parents a lot about this. And I said, like, philosophically, there's 4 things about the IB that make them different. I mean, the first thing is they don't have a hidden curriculum. Their curriculum is, which is traditionally hidden, is front and center. You know, they don't say, you're talking about what's been happening recently for you in your own experience. But the IB learner profile, which says this is what our students should learn, talks about kids. They have to be caring and principled, and they have to be risk takers. There's soft skills, right? Yeah. But it's not a hidden, indirect part of the curriculum. And this is what was radically different about the IB. It wasn't about, you know, the hidden values of the curriculum. Saying, look, we're not going to hide our values. We want a curriculum that says our kids at the end of it will be good international students, will be open-minded, we want to create, and the words from the mission statement are, we want to create a better, more peaceful world, you know. And this in many parts of the world, the IB has problems with this. You know, if you look at, there's a program, there's a campaign group in the US, and I can't remember what it's called now. I'm not sure if it's IB, the trouble with IB, or the truth about IB. Okay. And it's this organization set up by parents who are deeply concerned that the IB is imposing liberal worldviews, that it's funded by the UN, that it's a Marxist organization that is inculcating these dangerous values, that it's anti-religious, and that consequently US schools shouldn't be funding it, because the biggest growth area for the IB at the moment is in state schools in the US. Right. It's un-Christian, it's un-American. And, you know, seriously, in places like Texas, you can imagine that these the hidden curriculum, which is saying out front, we want to create a better world, which is, you know, about international understanding. That's not very American for them. Right, yeah. The second thing that makes the IB different, and this again is partly from the French, German aspect of it, is it doesn't have the same subject hierarchy that a lot of national curricula do, even in Switzerland. So maths, for example, you have to do maths, but it's no more important than if you chose to do art. Right. It has the same amount of time. It has the same amount of value in terms of the points that you get at the end. It's worth 7 points, 7 points for art, 7 points for history, 7 points. It's all out of 7, right? And that's quite radical. It means that a student can also choose higher level in subjects that they particularly like, and put emphasis on subjects like I teach film in group 6, for example. Right. That idea that, you know, film or media could be considered more important if you did it at a higher level than maths as a standard level is quite different. And importantly, it has a core. It's called the IB core, which is nothing to do with academics. It's not to do with your core is TOK, something called CAS, which is the classic hidden curriculum out front and center, because CAS is community action and service. You know, kids have to go and do some work in the community. They have to do CAS. And that's assessed. You know, if you don't do it, you don't get your IB diploma. Right, Extended essay, you have to do your research. If you don't do that, you don't get your diploma. And, you know, TOK is a core subject. Every kid has to do the course of TOK. The third thing I'd say is that the declarative knowledge that is the nature of a curriculum, what we've spoken about around the world, is not what defines the IB. The IB is defined by critical thinking, problem solving, inquiry driven, students, and all those things we were saying earlier. That's what it is. And it's moved increasingly in that direction. Little example, the history curriculum 20 years ago had a lot of specified content that you had to teach. It's ditched it all. Okay. It's now only questions. It's questions and possible content. Right. And finally, for me, the most exciting part about the IB is that it doesn't come with any university or state authority whatsoever. It's bottom up. The people who run the IB, it's a multinational corporation now, and it's reflecting that in some ways. But
that's the goal of any bottom-up movement, right?
Right. But as a history teacher within the IB, I've had opportunities to be on working groups, to write textbooks, to be an examiner, to be a senior examiner. The whole system depends upon the contribution of the teachers who are in it, which means as a system, it's incredibly flexible. It goes through these 7-year cycles. So as soon as a new curriculum is introduced, they're already working on the new one. for 7 years' time.
Right. Okay.
And this is ongoing. So it's incredibly responsive, and it is evolving all the time. And that evolution is driven by the teachers. For me, that's the thing. And it was there in the very beginning. And this is the book, actually. Schools Across Frontiers. The guy who was most responsible for setting up the IB. His name is ADC Peterson. And from the very beginning, it was teachers who were setting up with academics initially. And there's always in the academic, there's an authority behind it. Your senior examiner is always an academic, okay? But your teams or chief examiner, your senior examiners, your markers, they're teachers currently teaching the syllabus. And for me, that's the nature of it. And that's for some schools in some parts of the world, that's the biggest challenge. I think it's one of the challenges with them, because they are so used to being told what to do.
Yeah.
You've got an IB teacher, as I said, like a history curriculum, there's a lot of options, a lot of questions. The content, it's up to you. Now you can buy the books off the shelf if you want. There's hundreds of them written, but you can devise your own, and they have to, because the way in which history can be taught in Texas is different to the way in which you can be taught in Saudi Arabia, for example.
Right.
There are IB schools in Saudi Arabia and in Texas. So how do you create a curriculum that allows history to be taught in both those countries?
Yeah.
So for me, that is ultimately why the IB has been so successful. Is that last point, that it is responsive to teachers, and still, despite the fact that it's a major, and in terms of growth, it's probably one of the most successful companies. It's on a par with Apple or something. The way in which it's grown in the last 10, 15 years. That growth is largely because teachers run the show. So, little thing to illustrate: if you are in the IB program, and I'm doing this with my current school, every one of your teachers has to be trained, has to be inculcated into the cult of the IB. You've got to do a 3-day training course. Right. Okay. And it's somewhere else in Europe, and you'll fly out and you'll do your 3-day training, and you meet lots of other IB teachers, and you become part of that global community of IB teachers. It's brilliant. It's a wonderful experience. It costs a fortune, right, to school, but they have to do it because the IB insists. Now, the IB obviously makes money out of it. It's part of their business model. Right. But what a fantastic business model. It says that every single one of them has to be trained, and when the new curriculum is introduced, they have to be retrained. So it's an ongoing educational process. And those workshops, although they've because it got so big, they've created, it's a series of private companies that run them now. Those companies are all run by IB teachers. And all the workshops are delivered by IB teachers. Brilliant. It's a community of teachers delivering a program that they effectively wrote themselves. So you feel part of it. Yeah, no, that's great. I feel like I'm proselytizing. I feel like I'm trying to convert the world. That's great. I mean, obviously some of that's you say you've been thinking about this a lot lately, and so some of these kind of conclusions that you've come to. I'm in that position where people are asking, why are we spending all this money? Right, I see. But it seems to me, because as I said, I mean, it's all quite new to me. I've been very, sort of peripherally aware of IB as I've worked in a number of different schools, and interact with teachers from different places, and it's been an area of it's been an area of ignorance for me, really. When I'm having conversations about education on the broader spectrum, often IB will come up, and it's just something I've not generally had much to say about because I've had no direct experience with it. And so for a number of reasons lately, I've just really started looking into it. And it seems in a lot of ways to be a possible solution for many of the problems that I've identified in either the systems or the schools that I've worked with. The kind of solutions that I come up with are often, well, that's how IB does it. But I don't encounter IB very much here. There are some IB schools here. I don't know how true this is globally, but it seems that basically the competition is, if a school is deciding to go international, it's either the Cambridge curriculum or the IB. And one of the big differences that I've noticed, and you'll perhaps have more to say about this than I do, is that the Cambridge curriculum is easier to just drop into whatever system is already running. It's just the Cambridge curriculum is kind of you're subscribing to content.
where
Right.
the IB does seem to be a pedagogical shift.
You're
Right.
inculcated the cult. As I was
Right,
saying earlier,
right,
it's a
yeah. And so it seems
different
that, you know,
way of
you
looking at it.
you have to send the teacher, you know, you talk about these kind of these 3-day workshops and the training that you go through. But here in Indonesia, the teachers that I work with and the schools that I work with, you know, that 3 days, I mean, you have to go back to the drawing board with teachers here. If you want to, I mean, we mentioned earlier, the idea of conceptualizing teaching and thinking as a teacher, okay, well, what is it that I do? What is teaching? And I mean, these kind of seemingly philosophical, conceptual questions are natural for me. They're at the heart of what I've done since I was a teacher. That's how I've always approached it. But for the majority of teachers that I work with here, and certainly, you know, the farther back in time you go, the more it is just a fact of teaching that, you know, teachers don't think about teaching in those terms. They think about it in content terms. You know, what is my topic for today? And to introduce IB here, which is, you know, many of the things that I love about my idea of IB, which is still kind of a loose one. But the things that I would love to see happen more in schools here would require a complete back to the drawing board restart for teachers, where they'd have to be completely retrained and re-educated on what teaching is. You couldn't just do a 3-day, you know, a 3-day initiation.
No. Right. That's the thing. The reason why the school I'm currently at has decided to do this is because they, as I said earlier, they're an IB school in all but name. In that if you look at their mission statement, if you look at what they've tried to do in the last years, they have all of those IB qualities. But what they lack is possibly the teachers that are trained in the way that we've just described, and that what the IB does, you know, is, in addition to those 3-day training things you've got to go on, is there is an expectation that the whole, not only the curriculum, but approaches to learning, as it's called, the ATLs within the IB, are embedded right the way through the school.
Right.
And, you know, you get inspected by the IB as well, I should point out, every 5 years.
Right,
so
okay.
you are being continually reviewed on it. So, but then there is an expectation that the teachers are working regularly in groups led by the IB coordinator, the DP coordinator, to do things like integrate these approaches to learning or integrate theory of knowledge. Because theory of knowledge we haven't spoken about.
I want to, yeah.
But theory of knowledge is a sort of separate lesson within the curriculum, but it's supposed, if it's done well, to be something that all teachers will refer to all the time in all their lessons. Okay. You're always looking for TOK opportunities. And all that basically means is you are going to reflect on how we learn and what we know, and whether we know as much as we think we know, and whether what we think we know is founded on any sort of scientific basis, or whether it's more of a cultural thing that gives us. But that's reflective, and it's at the heart of what the IB tries to do, and it's forcing the students and the teachers into these very, very often uncomfortable moments where they are having to actually challenge what they are doing when they're doing it, because the student can ask a very interesting question. Well, how do we know that?
Right.
You're teaching me this, but what's the basis on which I should believe what you're telling me?
Sure. Yeah. Which is a question that is, I think, now, it's a question you would expect the young people now to start asking. It's a question that, you know, it's a question that does not presume authority, where education for so long has just been built around an authority model where you wouldn't question something like that. You would be expected not to question it. You wouldn't, you know, but now students that's the environment that we're in, right? You expect students, and yet most teachers who are not from the IB formula or something like it, wouldn't be able to answer that question, or you'd be annoyed that the question were asked in the first place, let alone you know, struggle to answer it.
And again, I think one of the other big challenges, not so much for the UK, but not so much for the UK and the UK system of education, but in many parts of Europe, for example, that you have the threat of redoublement, which is you fail the year, you repeat. And assessment, and I don't want to talk about assessment because we haven't got time, but assessment as it's used within most parts of the European continent is what I've described as sort of disciplinary assessment. You
Yeah.
basically can get away with teaching in very unimaginative ways,
Yeah.
in the ways we've described previously, just delivering content, because the kids, if I use that example from earlier, at the end of 6 weeks, will have to remember that content.
Right.
And it's high stakes, because if they don't, they
The
fail.
highest of stakes. Yeah, that's it. Right.
They fail. And failure means that they might have to repeat the year, or that they might not be accepted into the academic stream, which allows them to go to university. And that's a sort of Damocles hanging over the kids the whole time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which has the effect of deadening the initiative of teachers, partly because they don't need to do anything other than that, but also because they got to get through that content, because that content's what's going to be assessed. And this is again, we said earlier about the washback effect, the backwash effect, the tail wagging the dog. Assessment, again, it's the problem of how you have an assessment system. The assessment system ruins education. If it's now, the IB's assessment system is pretty good and quite imaginative and quite creative, but even that spoils the day sometimes. But at the end of it, you've got to have a system in place that
got to be something, of course,
fairly is able to distinguish between the different levels at which students are at, so they can or cannot go to the university of their choice. So it is, again, it's about this dialectic of, on the one hand, the need for fairness, and on the other hand, the need to avoid the backwash effect that damages what education can be. Yeah.
Which seems to be the thing that, I mean, it's one of the things I rally against most, is the standardization of assessment in the format that we see so commonly around the world. It's one of the things that I kind of stand most against, but it also is a concept that seems most prone to kind of creep in to, a new education system might be born that sounds great, but what eventually happens is you have to assess it, and so assessment is formulated, and eventually that becomes more and more standardized until you have a standardized testing system, which then reverberates through the entire education system. And it seems, because history thus far has showed us that it's unavoidable, and so hopefully the IB will be, will not go down that path. But it seems to be the one thing that always creeps in and ruins everything.
It has crept in, of course it has, but there's also the other side of it, which is if you don't grade it, then it's not
right. It's got to be something, of course. Yeah, there has to be something, and that's where the tension.
There is a continual tension, I think, with this in the IB, and in terms of standardization, for goodness sake, the IB has schools in 140 odd countries or whatever. 150. Right. So in terms of standardization, you're talking about a massive range of educational pre-experience before the IB. That when you're writing an exam paper for history or for geography or for maths, has got to allow these various cultures to be able to understand what it is that is expected. And that then creates a bigger problem for the IB, which has happened over the last 15, 20 years that I've seen, is that you have to standardize increasingly the examination, because if you create any ambiguity in how the questions are being asked, then it will be interpreted by different cultures in different ways. And so they've trained and they've retrained, and the history exam is a very good example of that, how it's become increasingly narrow in its expectations and formulaic. But at least people understand the formula.
Yeah, right.
And as long as the students,
and as you said, I mean, it seems to be much more. It just seems to be much more apparent, and not, it's the formula of exams. I mean, one thing as a language teacher, again, that I'm very familiar with here is like the IELTS and the TOEFL exams. These are tests of English, and getting a good grade on those tests, it has as much to do with knowing the format of the test as it does with actually having the competence that's supposedly being tested. And so often what gets students to pass a test, whether it's these language tests or the standardized tests in so many curricula, is being trained in test taking. And it seems that, again, I don't know, you'll have to correct me here where it needs to be, but it seems that perhaps because the IB is a little bit more explicit about its core values and its goals, perhaps, I don't know, is that less of an issue there, where the students, you don't need to be trained in test taking as much, perhaps?
You do some test, obviously, preparation. You will teach to some extent the skills that will be required in the examination. There's a couple of things though. You're over 2 years, so you can take your time. You might work on that test preparation,
right.
which allows you to do some proper teaching in the meantime. It's not a continue. There are, in each of the 6 subject areas, including maths and the sciences, there are research-based projects that they've got to do. The maths project, for example, is a real-life example. We were talking about that earlier.
Good. Yeah.
All applied. It's all applied examples.
Brilliant.
And then you've got TOK and you've got CAS and you've got all the other things going on at the same time. Most of which is they're not examined at the end; they're examined continually, through essays and so on. So there's continual assessment, but it is inevitable that to some extent, there's going to have to be a standardization that will influence the way in which the students are taught. But I think the IB's got the balance just about right at the moment.
Yeah, it certainly seems, again, with what little awareness I have, it certainly seems to be doing a better job of that than other curricula do.
And the fact that it is reflective of the teachers who are currently teaching it, I think that helps enormously as well. One simple example of that is that in TOK, traditionally there was, again, a nice example of how you do an assessment. The students had to give a presentation as part of their assessment in groups, a group presentation, right? Which was great, except if you've got a class of 30 doing TOK, or maybe 2 classes of 30, how many presentations are you going to have to, how many presentations the whole class going to have to sit through?
Yes.
And it kills.
Yeah, of course.
So they're replacing that with another form of assessment. But
good.
That's based upon the feedback from the teachers. So we'd rather not do these presentations, rather than it being, well, no, that's the fairest way to do it. That's what you're going to do.
Yeah. That was one of the biggest surprises for me, actually.
And the different system is we're going to come up with a...
You finish first, go ahead.
Yeah, finish.
We've got a bit of a lag. That's just so one of the things that surprised me, actually, as I mentioned earlier, the theory of knowledge, this TOK, was something one of the things that first drew me to an interest in IB, because it's something that's so central in what I do. To find out then that there's a curriculum out there that is built around it was really quite exciting. And then I was very surprised to later find that this TOK is not just a core principle, but it's its own subject. I was quite surprised to find that it's a subject rather than something that runs through. So I still don't fully understand how that works.
Well, look, you've got to do, as an IB school, you've got to do, I think it's 100 hours of TOK. You've got to deliver 100 hours of TOK.
Right, okay.
The students have to do the new syllabus that's about to start, they will have to do 2 forms of assessment, one of which is an essay, fairly traditional, on a certain number of subjects, which are questions that are fixed every year. At the moment, they do a presentation. That will be replaced by something that's going to be slightly different, more like a scientific exhibition, where they'll have to have three objects and talk about them, and you can have that as an open evening, for example. It sounds to me like a really good step in the right direction.
Sounds good.
How do you do it? Well, schools can do it in different ways. How they deliver those 100 hours is up to them, but there's a curriculum you have to follow. But it's largely questions. And you have somebody who's responsible for TOK, but you can have a school, and I think the best way it works is when you have a TOK coordinator who broadly coordinates all the teachers to come in and do 3-4 sessions on maths, 3-4 sessions on science.
Right. Yeah, I like the sound of that.
You then have sessions afterwards where you work with the students on, well, what do we get from that,
Yeah, okay.
You then have, of course, a system in place where those teachers have to coordinate that. They have to be sitting down together and talking about how's that TOK program going to work. And for me, that's the great benefit, is when you have these regular IB diploma teams, we have your diploma team together, and you'll be talking about the usual admin stuff and whatever. Who's going to do this extended essay? When do you want to have your internal assessment done? But then, what are we doing in TOK at the moment? What have you done recently in TOK? And so we're all aware of what the students have and haven't been doing. It's a way of just making this whole program more coherent.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, yeah, good. I mean, it seems to me, again, aligning it with what my approach has been, it seems that just bringing the concept into the lexicon of the faculty seems to be one of the great values of it, because it gets, regardless of what the students, how the students are handling it and interacting with it, that's I think a different question that the IB deals with quite directly. For me, it's just interesting to get the teachers thinking in those terms, because, as I said, that's lacking in so much education.
I would say
it's not just a direct transfer of knowledge.
But it isn't always done that way.
Right.
And that's the way it should be done, I think. And in some schools, you'll get some poor person who is, draws the short straw and has to do the IB program because they're short of hours that year.
Right.
And then then TOK is a disaster.
Right.
And then
Sure.
TOK doesn't work. And kids will have, if you talk to former IB students, they'll have a wide range of experiences of what TOK is like. Some, if something they hated at the time, but find it so useful at university.
Wow. Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I can
looking
imagine.
back, there were some who it was just dreadful because the teacher was rubbish, because they weren't. Yeah. Nobody's trained to be a TOK teacher,
Right.
There is a separate philosophy program within the IB, which is a subject you can choose to do. And the point that they always make is TOK isn't philosophy, but it helps if you've got some philosophy. You're trying to organise it, I have to say.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But there are some who think it was the best thing they did in the IB program. Whatever, and that. Perhaps that's a minority, unfortunately, but it's that light touch the IB has. They don't insist on how things are delivered generally.
Right.
Philosophy. This is our approach. These are the number of hours you've got a curriculum. These are the people you need to be trained. They will check on the variables they can measure.
Mm-hmm.
That they expect to see the curriculum written down. They'll expect to see the funding that has gone into delivering the IB.
Right.
They expect to see the certificates that you get awarded when you've been on the TOK training course.
Right. Okay.
All of that, they expect to see it, and they will check it every 5 years, as I said earlier.
Right. Okay.
And when you're being established as an IB school, it's very, very strict that you've got all of those things in place. Now, I'm excited because I'm in a brand new school which doesn't do the IB. I've got 20 years of experience, and I know what I'd like my IB program to be like.
Yeah,
so I can set up and say, look, this is how the TOK
Good. Yeah.
Okay. Well. So this is how I want the TOK program to work. I want you to fund it in this way, and I want the timetable to fix these periods where these people can come in and deliver. That's how, because I have it from scratch.
Yeah, right. That I think probably we'll look at drawing to a close now. I wonder though if you'd be interested in doing another call at some point just on that, because I think just discussing the options and the styles of how TOK could be approached, and also for a lot of the audience, that's just what TOK is, and really kind of I think that's an entire subject of its own that's well worth exploring in a lot more depth. What do you think? I'm
going to say I'm not an expert.
Sure.
I've taught TOK. I think there are probably people better qualified to do it. I'm going to be the IB coordinator. I am IB coordinator. I'm going to be the TOK teacher. I'm not currently teaching it.
Yeah,
I'm not in the IB program until next year. I haven't taught IB for 17 years. I'm aware of the changes. I don't feel enough of an expert on TOK to sort of tell you I can talk for an hour and a half.
No, but I mean, I think, and again, not to put any pressure anywhere, but I think it would be interesting to kind of go through that process in a kind of vocal, open way. This is as you approach it and plan it out for yourself and develop it for yourself. I think that would be really interesting because again, I mean, you're obviously far more knowledgeable of it than I am, but that's what it would be for me as well, would be kind of a learning process, and to do that kind of learning in a public way, I think would be quite interesting, perhaps, if you agree. There is still one other question I'd like to ask that doesn't go down that route though. You've already talked about again, coming back to this, the workshop, the 3-day kind of initiation workshop, where you said you do that at a kind of a central location. Yeah. So you go overseas to do that training, and you meet a lot of teachers there.
Well, you don't have
how
to,
much,
yeah.
How much then do you stay in touch with those teachers, and how much as you go on, do you share resources and share teaching ideas and things like that?
That's exactly it. That is the great value of those courses.
Right. Okay.
I went on my first one in 2000 in Zagreb. So exactly 20 years ago, about 2 weeks ago. I'm still in contact on Facebook with 2 of the teachers I met that week.
Wow.
Every conference, every one of these I've been to. I went to one last year to be an IB coordinator. There's a WhatsApp group. I regularly get updates. There were 20 people on it. There's 20 people in there. You ask a question, someone will answer it.
Yeah.
It's a global community, and it's a very small community in the end. Because although there are, however, 4,000 schools or whatever, maybe more now around the world doing the IB, when you start looking at subject areas and you get involved in these various online communities like the Facebook groups, various subjects, is, you start to recognize the names. It's I've been here for 20 years, so I know a lot of people in the IB.
Yeah, right.
And it's one of the things you realize. I've been recently with my current school visiting other IB schools, just get a sense of what it's like for my management or for the other teachers. And every place I've been to, somebody knows me.
Yeah, wow.
It's a global community. It really is. But it's a family. It's a family of teachers. But it comes back to that point that there is so much involvement by the teachers. That's why you're always looking to communicate with other teachers, because the IB requires that of you. You can't lock yourself away and deliver an IB program.
Right. Now that does seem to be the most attractive aspect, I think, about it all for me, is the level of engagement that's required by the teacher. The program is built on that engagement, but also seems to be, as we've perhaps already insinuated, one of the bigger challenges as well is getting teachers to be that engaged in teaching when so many are coming from a background, coming from a curriculum, coming from a system where they're not required to do that. And it really is just it's just a job, they're there to deliver content. To then get that mentality, to shift that mentality so dramatically towards one of a philosophical involvement in the practice of teaching. That's got to be one of the biggest challenges for the system as well, right?
Yeah, and when you go to those conferences, or because they're IB conferences, and when you go to those workshops, there'll be 20 people in a room, and there'll be 17 nationalities in the room often as well, and maybe they're teaching in maybe 13, 14 different countries and coming from different backgrounds, and there's always 3 or 4 Brits, right? There's always a few Brits in the room, and they often are still, despite everything, the largest group group in the room, and they will be the ones who lead it.
Right.
Because they experienced of doing that. They're used to thinking that way. It's in English as well.
Yes.
A lot of people working in the second language. So in terms of soft power globally, the IB has been for the UK and their international education system, because it is a UK English with American influence in parts of the world.
Yeah, right.
But it's very much about spreading what education means to the British around the world, because the IB is very, very much centered upon British educational attitudes from the late 1960s and 1970s.
Right, interesting. Yeah, okay, that's fascinating. I think that might be a decent place for us to stop here. This has gone on really, really, really nicely, and I think we've scratched the surface of a couple of things there that I'd love to come back and do more on. So it might be a nice place to kind of take a pause now and maybe get back to in the future if you're down for that. So as we end this one, is there anything in particular that you would suggest people look up if they're interested in this, or anywhere that they can find you, or any of the projects or any of the work that you're doing publicly that people can find?
Yeah, well, I'm searchable. So if my name is attached to this,
yes, will be, of course, yeah. And I'll put any links that you mentioned. I'll put in the.
I'll put a few links, anyway. And maybe references to a couple of the books that I mentioned as well.
That'd be great. Yeah,
on the history of the IB, I think is interesting. Okay.
Well, that's great. Thanks a lot for the time. And as I say, I'd be very keen to speak with you again. All right. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Okay, thanks. Cheers.
Bye now.
Bye.